away.
All right, welcome back. Welcome to another ArborJet webinar. Thank you for taking your time on this 198th day of March. It's been interesting. As a lot of you folks in the industry probably know, events after March 8th have just been canceled, postponed, moved to online platforms like this, and it's forced a lot of us to adapt. And really grateful that you took the time to come. Hopefully it's worth your time today. In case you didn't get the memo, I try not to take life too serious, but certainly delivering some of this content to you today, hopefully you get something out of it. Okay, and when we look at the title, Tree A.D.D, right, Abiotics, Diseases and Disorders, part of it is, for those who haven't picked up yet, part of it is a play on words, or at least a play on letters. As some of you folks may know, I have suffered from ADD in the past. And in fact, ADHD, which is something that you can be medicated for. And when I was younger, my medication, or at least what my parents would prescribe, was to go outside, get out of here. So taking that momentum, taking that idea, and kind of moved it into our professional career and our day-to-day life. So hopefully nobody's too offended by that. In a society that we live in now, I just hope that folks can smile a little bit during this webinar. So get comfortable. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. Zach will get them squared away towards the end. If you need to pop coffee, beer, Adderall, Ritalin, whatever you're into, just go ahead and do it now before we really get into it. All right. So I love trees so much, and I love skiing so much, that having this tree ADD, this inability to focus on anything other than trees and always tie trees into everything, is difficult, especially when you're skiing trees, okay? It's so bad in my world that I can't even sit down at the end of the day without thinking about trees. I mean, look, double oak, twice barrel. And of course, you know, I'm married to my wife, Pamela, have been for a number of years now. And my tree ADD, like a lot of yours, has gotten so bad that when we go on hikes or picnics, I'm really not focused on my loved one. We might be flirting back and forth, but I'm really wondering what's happening with that tree and why is the canopy fading in the background? For those not laughing yet, no, that's not really me. I don't wear flip-flops. But the condition is real though, and we can honestly, and all of us can get distracted. So let's take some of that momentum today. The first couple things we'll talk about will be abiotics. So those could be things that are non-living. Those could be like weather or growing conditions, things like that. We'll also touch on a couple diseases, or at least my take or our take on diseases, and go from there. And then we'll cover some disorders, because this is the time of the year where we can address some more of those. And because we have A.D., Tree D, other cool stuff too. So stay tuned. When we're looking at trees, a lot of us professionals like to go through this diagnostic checklist in our minds. The first thing we need to do is to identify the host. That's the host tree, host shrub, species, whatever that may be. The next thing we need to do is to look for different signs and symptoms. Now, that could be little insects, bugs, it could be fruiting bodies, things like that. You might even see some exit holes or some other leaf damage. And of course, if you are an industry professional, if you are an arborist, you're probably getting called out to look at these things. So it's important that you know the ones, or at least most of the ones that are common in your region. And then once again, is it biotic, which means living, or abiotic, which would mean non-living? And then the fifth and final thing that you're going to want to do, regardless of the tree, is just evaluate the site. Because oftentimes there's not something wrong with the tree that's caused by an insect or disease. It might have to do with the site. To give you a brief run through of a scenario of what a walk in the park would be like with somebody with tree ADD, wondering what's off a little bit. I was walking in Idaho Falls last summer, right along the Snake River. Great fishing, by the way. And noticed something that caught my eye as I was walking to dinner. And it was this shrub on the side. Now, as I got closer, I started to notice that those leaves are kind of mangled, distorted, but I couldn't see anything on it. So I looked on the back side of that shrub. And for those wondering, no, that's not poison ivy. That is not poison ivy. And you can clearly see the difference between those leaves, right? Well, if we go through that diagnostic checklist in this instance, what we would do is first identify the host. We know that the host is a type of box elder, right? Acer negundo. That's not what the leaves should normally look like. So we're looking for different signs. Do we see any chewing marks? Do we see any insects? Anything going on with that new growth? Any patterns? And the only patterns is that the leaves are severely mangled. Is it abiotic or biotic? Too hard to tell. So then we look at the location. And as an arborist, as somebody who's passionate about trees, it's oftentimes hard for us to look all the way down at the ground. If you look at the ground, you'll notice that the turf is impeccable. It looks amazing. What we could diagnose that issue with that box elder would be herbicide damage. So just something to think about. We didn't just arrive at that answer, there was a process. So for folks who have gone through this exercise before, maybe you do this at every tree, this is just a friendly reminder. And for those that haven't, well, welcome to the tree world. And it's gonna get a lot more fun from here. If I don't know how to do something around the house, what I like to do is go to YouTube. Unfortunately, folks who call themselves industry professionals also turn to YouTube for some things, even as simple as planting a tree. Now, for those of you smiling out there in the cloud, and I'm sure you all are at this point, that's not the correct way to plant a tree, probably. But also to you in attendance today, how many of us have shown up to a property where the tree was declining over 2 to 3 years and you go and it looks like this? Burlap's still on, the bag's still on, the twine's still on. Not an ideal growing or living condition for any tree, right? But they call you out and they say, hey, come on, help it, fix it. One of my favorites that we're starting to see more and more of, especially in new developments, is something that I thought was, I didn't know we had much of in North America. It's mulch volcanoes. You'll oftentimes hear the excuse or the explanation from a landscape professional saying, yeah, but it's keeping the moisture in. Well, for any landscape professional who's actually gone and stuck their hand inside those mulch rings, you'll realize that moisture really doesn't get too far. So we know now that it doesn't allow for a lot of airflow and it doesn't allow for a lot of moisture to penetrate those roots, especially when it's just recently transplanted. Or what about when you show up and you see this? How can you have tree A.D.D and not see this with, like, I'm not a math magician, but like 90% of trees in the landscape? What are you supposed to do as an arborist when you see this? Panic is not the right answer. If you leave those girdling roots, eventually what's going to happen is it's going to cut off the flow of water and nutrients going up and down in that tree. So you'll see some of that canopy decline. And if you go long enough without addressing the issue and you have a wind event, oftentimes you'll see trees just completely fail at that site. No, they're not going to change species, but they will fail at that site. So what can we do about it? During my undergrad back in Wisconsin, one of the things we talked about is air spade or air excavation. How can we look at these roots and really address the issues? So what an air spade is it's a tool that uses compressed air to basically blast away any compacted soil, any soil with high pH, and it helps you see those girdling roots. What you can do then is you can take a chisel and you can go ahead and actually physically, mechanically remove that root. Now, if you don't trust your technician with a chisel, maybe you'll trust them with an old saw and they can go ahead and do that. One of my college professors used to ask us all the time, how big of a root can you remove, a girdling root can you remove and have a good benefit or a positive benefit on the tree? And how do you measure that result? And his answer, no matter what you said, was, it doesn't matter, because if you do nothing, what that root is going to do to that tree far exceeds what it won't if you remove it. The last thing that I would like to say just on root collar excavation and removing girdling roots is, please, 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 for your safety and the tree's safety, do not use your top handle to cut away girdling roots. There are better tools for the job. So that one is a no. Well, let's just say you're not from this industry. Let's say you're the average homeowner and you only hear about trees, or really only think about trees a few times out of the year. The main one is when you have a storm roll in. You could turn on any news channel, if you're into that sort of thing, and see snow or storm or ice damage any time of the year. And this is oftentimes when trees get on the news. So this is when I have family members calling, hey, Korey, come back. We need your help. But trees also do fail during events depending on where you are in the country. So for instance, this summer, derecho, it took and it wiped out thousands and thousands of trees. So all of a sudden, we're starting to get more tree awareness for the ones that are surviving. Those trees that survived those catastrophic events just increased in value. So your responsibility to take care of them also went up in value. About flooding. My heart goes out to anybody in the South who's dealing with any flooding right now. It's got to be hard on you. It's also probably hard on the trees. If we think about it, a lot of these events are really hard on the trees. These unideal living situations allow that tree, in many instances, to get different insects and diseases. So the first disease we'll talk about today is called pine wilt disease. And for those of you still paying attention, technically, it's not really a disease. It's actually a microscopic nematode or nematode. And what these nematodes are is they're these little worm-like critters. And you could fit about 1 million on your thumb. And what they do is they attack typically non-native 2 to 3 needle pines. So that would be your Scots, Austrian red Hugos. And what they do is they block up that vascular system so the tree can no longer move water and nutrients. What'll happen is that tree will basically choke itself out. Now, we say typically in non-native 2 to 3 needle pines, but in 2017, in a stand here in Colorado, about 6,500 foot of elevation, a previous nematologist from K-State was able to culture pine wilt nematode on his property. He just retired after giving back to the industry for 30 years, trying to get away from all this, and he found it on his property. So maybe you've seen it before, not really sure. We've got viewers coming in from all over. So just a couple things to look at and how you could identify it in the field. Typically with pine wilt disease, or the pine wilt nematode, we'll see a top-down death, and the tree will typically fade almost. You think about it, it kind of turns a yellow, and it's really, really rapid. So within about a week, maybe 2, sometime in June, July, maybe early August, your tree will go from green and healthy to just yellow, brown, standing dead, which of course is also a fire hazard, but we'll talk about that later maybe. If you're in the field and you're starting to see some of this blue stain fungi, it's not always related to pine wilt. It's not a sure sign. It's not 100% guaranteed that that's what you have, but they have been seen together. The real way to identify this or to confirm that that's what you have would be to send it into a diagnostic lab. And we can answer more questions about that later. But if you're doing the removal, I mean, that wood is just, it's super lightweight. You'll feel like you really got good at your job, or you got strong, because removing that wood is just, it's light like balsa wood. Makes you feel like a hero. So how these nematodes move from tree to tree is by that little fella. That's the pine sawyer beetle, and it vectors or moves the nematode from one tree to the next in the early spring. Now, if you're coming across a property that looks something like this in the summer, the best thing you can do would probably be sanitation. Remove that infected tree. Get it off the site, grind the stump, just get it out of there. And then go ahead and do some other treatments. The only treatments we have for this pest, they're actually preventative only. So once your tree looks like this on screen, it's too late. And if you think about it from the tree's perspective, if that tree can't move water and nutrients up and down, how is it going to move that product that you just introduced to the tree? So preventative only would be what we would suggest. Trunk injections would be with the triage products. Triage G4, which is a general use 4% active product, or Triage R10, which is a restricted use 10% active product. Now, for those of you who have ever trunk injected an evergreen, and I know a number of you on screen have, fun is not the first word that would come to your mind. Probably. So any time, any chance that you can inject a tree, an evergreen, with a product like R10, where you're going to use a lot less volume, the better off you and your relationship with whoever else is on the property will be. Okay? Tell you how I really feel about that. The next disease that we'll talk about is fire blight disease. And the reason I think we need to talk about this, even though it's not something we typically see until the spring, is because in our industry right now, there are a lot of folks going around talking about this as the next biggest fungus. The biggest problem with that is it's not a fungus. Actually, it's a bacteria. So any arborist who's coming onto your property talking about doing fungicide sprays or fungicide treatments might need to have another conversation with them, okay? This is a bacteria, for those who aren't familiar. It's a bacteria, and it typically affects plants in the rose family. So that would be your apple, crabapple, pear. Now, in the last couple summers, we have seen and cultured it in things like hawthorn, mountain ash, quince, serviceberry, things like that. So it is around. It is something that everybody should know about, at least. This disease is pretty easy to identify because you'll see otherwise healthy looking trees with all these wilted leaves to them. Different clumps of the tree will have these just wilted leaves that still stay on, and even what we would call a shepherd's crook. So they'll stay on, but they'll be keeled over. And typically that shepherd's crook is more obvious as summer progresses. If you're close enough to that plant to get a good look for those black stems on the canker. Now, there are a few things that will do this to an otherwise healthy plant, but between the shepherd's crook and that black stem, it's a pretty good giveaway that that's what you got. So one of the best things to come out of Colorado State University in recent years, well, it's not the football program. It's probably this graph. And what this does is it illustrates just how this bacteria is moving around the plant. So it overwinters in these cankers, and then in the springtime, as the juices within the plant start flowing, what'll happen is that bacteria is going to start to spread. And it really, really spreads heavily, especially from pollinators during the blooming time. So as those pollinators move from plant to plant to plant, they basically, once again, they vector or they move this bacteria all over. And in the spring, you might see wilted looking petals. And maybe in that early summer, you'll start to see that shepherd's crook start to form. And it'll be pretty obvious, especially as the summer progresses. And certainly, depending on where you are and what part of the growing region, you will see this decline go into the winter. So, and then once again, that bacteria is just going to live within those cankers. So in the wintertime, it's really, really important that if you're looking for control over this pest, that you do different things. Do plant-resistant varieties. Do dormant or winter prune. Make sure you're sanitizing between cuts. Folks have been doing this in the orchards for years. And this is something where, as an arborist professional, my job is to educate, but it's also to move this industry forward. So if we just jump off as leaders in the industry and just say, hey, chemical treatment, chemical treatment, chemical treatment, how far does that really take us? And what is that really doing for the plant? How do you set that expectation for the homeowner? Because if you don't do that dormant prune in the winter, and you do the treatments that we're going to talk about this next spring, they're going to say is those treatments didn't work. That dead stuff is still up there. And for those of you who ever had to work with some really observant, shall we say, customers, that's a real issue. So how do we set that expectation? Now, yes, we are all in business. So let's discuss some of the chemical treatments that you could do. Now, some folks say that they always lead off with a spring copper spray. I haven't had much luck or success with that, but other folks have. Something that we would suggest would be a spring trunk injection with OTC, which is oxytetracycline. And no, I cannot spell it. The other suggestion that we would have is that you do a soil application with shortstop, and that's a plant growth regulator. So let's dive in more and look at both of those from a real high level on why they're going to work for you. So bacteria. I don't know what happened a couple hundred days ago, but everybody's real familiar with viruses and how those spread. But bacteria are a little bit different. Actually, they're a lot different. They're not even close to the same thing. How bacteria propagate and spread is they propagate when one bacteria basically starts to form a new cell wall or division in the middle of it. Now, that wall doesn't just come from anywhere. It comes from what we would call amino acids. They're basically like the proteins, or actually the building blocks of proteins, okay? Now, that's important. The amino acids are the building blocks of the proteins that are going to allow for basically the division and the multiplication of this pest. So if we can stop that division, we have a good chance at saving that tree. And that's where those OTC treatments come in. Because if you don't do an OTC treatment, what will happen within a day or maybe even a week is that bacteria is going to multiply. And this can happen 10, 20, 100, 200 spots in the canopy. And it's just going to multiply and multiply and multiply. That's why it's so important to get that product in at the proper timing. Now, technically, and we have been called out on this before, it's not an antibiotic because it's not forcing your body to produce antibodies. However, in our case, in our instances, we could refer to this as a tree antibiotic, okay? Just in our tree world, us tree nerds. The other treatment that we talked about doing was one with shortstop, 2SC, which is our plant growth regulator. And I'll just give you a quick rundown through it. So the SC just stands for suspended concentrate. The 2 means 2 pounds of active, right? That active ingredient is paclobutrazole. Now, many of you who have worked with us in the past know about the many different uses of this product, and we're actually going to discuss more in the coming weeks. It is used mostly for trees, but there is also a shrub label, and we sell it as a growth regulator. But that's just one of the things that it's really used for. If we think about it, to give you a brief overview of that, if we're reducing the growth, that energy needs to go somewhere. So if we take it out of that bucket that's going to produce new growth, what we'll see is that it goes somewhere else. So it'll go to defense compounds, fibrous roots, waxier leaves, right? See, makes sense. So check out the webinar, October 6th. I'm sure we'll have a couple emails go up between now and then, just to try to get you in there. But this is a very versatile tool. So although you're reading the active ingredients paclobutrazole and growth regulator, what's this going to do for fire blight? Well, the theory behind this is fire blight typically moves into a new part of the canopy or a new tree into new growth. So if we can reduce the growth by 30 to 75%, we're going to reduce the chances that this bacteria is going to be destructive by 30 to 75%. We should also have a much, much greener canopy as well. And once again, we could spend days. In fact, we will spend a day talking about this real soon. So something that I feel we need to talk about in our tree industry right now is trunk injection. How do we get here? How did this all happen? Well, trunk injection has been done for hundreds of years. In Europe, they used to inject arsenic into apple trees to try to kill some of the bugs. And that was, I don't know, 600 years ago, maybe more. New trunk injection really took place, 60s, 70s, when we started seeing more of these diseases work their way into the urban forests. Things like chestnut blight, oak wilt, and Dutch elm disease, which rolled through in the 70s in many, many different states. Now, Dutch elm disease and oak wilt are still real, and they're out there, and we have some good options for it. But as these new insects and diseases keep coming, it gets really tough. How do we come up with new chemistries? No, those are not ArborJet employees, although I do like the PPE and the beers. It was also during the late 80s and early 90s when Dr. Alex Shigo put out his book, Modern Arboriculture to Touch Trees. For anybody who went to school for this, and I'm sure many of you have, this is one of those core books that you keep on coming back to. You can't go to a single workshop without somebody referencing this book, at least in part. Most familiar to a lot of you would be CODIT, which is compartmentalization of decay in trees. So how does that relate to trunk injection? Well, anytime you're drilling into a tree, you're wounding that tree. So if we do the proper trunk injection methods, we should be able to give that tree the best fighting chance to come back and to outlive any of those pests that it's going to have. Now, we're not going to sit here today and focus exclusively on insects like that. Lilac ash borer, emerald ash borer. We could, but every single state in every single region has its own non-native, annoying, and invasive pests. No, instead today we'll talk about what is trunk injection. Less on those pests, but what is trunk injection? In 2016, and it took that long, ISA defined trunk injection as the process of applying treatments, which would be pesticides or fertilizers, directly into the active xylem. So for those who are not in the tree industry, xy high, flow low, right? Xylem high is going to move water and nutrients up, flow low. Where that product is going to be systemically distributed throughout the tree. It's just a fancy way of saying trees pulling it up and moving it out to the smaller limbs and leaves. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, why would we do micro tree injection? And I don't want to stand here and just tell you that this is the solution for everything, because it's not. There's no silver bullet in our industry. But tree injection is becoming wider and wider accepted because we have bigger treatment windows. With trunk injection, you're putting the product directly into the tree. So you can do this when it's windy out, where you live if you get wind, or rain. Also, we're not reliant so much on soil moisture with trunk injection. Certainly it does come into play, but it's not something that we're reliant on. Also, this is going to help us put the right product in that's going to target specific pests. And it's also going to give us, in many instances, longer or better results. So if that's not enough to get you on trunk injection for at least a few pests, maybe just the fact that you're showing up with really cool tools and equipment and you're not spraying stuff all over. As many of you know, I live in Colorado, and there are more than a few cities here in Colorado that are no longer allowing overhead spraying in the city limits. So trunk injection is a great option for that. When we look at micro injection, what we're talking about is applying smaller volumes, milliliters, maybe ounces. So think about like a tablespoon or maybe a shot glass, if you're into that sort of thing. Those products are either diluted or concentrated, and we have a solution, or there is a solution for just about everything out there. So if you haven't explored it yet, it certainly is worth entertaining. Now, we're not going to discuss each and every pest that trunk injection can control, but you might see one on the screen that maybe you have. Maybe you want to put some sort of focus into it in the coming years. This time of year, one of the biggest ones is Chlorosis, and we'll talk about that as a trunk injection opportunity in just a second. So real quickly, the methods of trunk injection are they're pretty basic. It's pretty straightforward. We're going to drill, take a drill bit, put it into the root flare, drill the hole. We're going to plug, we basically tap a little plastic plug into the root flare. Make sure when you're setting it too that you see a white ring all the way around it. And then we're going to introduce the chemistry. So this is a safe way to help make sure that no product is leaking out onto the ground. No dogs are coming to lick up whatever is seeping out. All of it's contained, it's all within the tree. Plus that plug gives the tree something to close over and grow over. Now, if we look at this cross section of how plugs are set, if you go too deep in any heartwood forming tree, the product's not really even going to leave. Injection time is going to take forever. The product might not leave. It's probably not going to end up where you want it to. If you go too shallow, this is when we typically see, or when we can see, bark separation. And you can also see some product leaking out if you don't tap that plug in far enough. But if you go just right, the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, just right, you'll see that white halo all around. Now, sidebar, because of tree ADD, trees can only put on new growth in 3 areas, 3 parts of the tree: buds, roots, and then what we would refer to as the cambium, which is a layer of cell division basically between the bark and the heartwood of the tree. Basically, really, it's that layer of cell division between the xylem and phloem, but we'll put it in terms like that. So if you set that plug where it's 100% in the active xylem, that means the cambium, which is where the cell division is going to happen, is on the outside. It's going to compartmentalize and close over that wound a lot quicker. So if you properly set that plug, you shouldn't have any issue. It should be one-time use only plug, and you come back a year or 2 later, depending on where you live, and you shouldn't even be able to see it. Now, trees don't heal. According to Dr. Alex Shigo, they compartmentalize, right? We talked about coated, compartmentalization of decay in trees. They don't heal. They don't put on new cells they close over wounds. So when you trunk injection, that's done and the plugs are set right, you will see that new wood come over the top. Now, as an arborist and a diehard tree physiologist and self-proclaimed nerd, my biggest concern about tree injection actually has to do with that discoloration behind and around those plugs. Well, thank goodness for Deb McCullough, Dr. Deb McCullough. Talk about good things coming out of Michigan State. This research, what she did is she looked at about 61 trees over a number of time, 6 years, basically using ArborJet's number 4 plug, Triage G4, and the Quick Jet Air. And what she found is that on 507 injection sites on 61 trees, she could only find damage on 16 of those sites. Now, once again, not a math magician, but I think 16, 5, it's somewhere around 3%, 2.5%, 3%. That falls into the range of acceptable for many of us arborists. Anyhow, she went on to say that discoloration, those cells are actually, they're still alive. They're still moving water up and down. She says that discoloration is just caused by a dye in the product, and it's not really dead tissue. So that was cool to say, and that was cool to see, and I can sleep better now knowing that. One of the pests that we want to touch on briefly here is chlorosis. Now, I say pests, but really it's probably a disorder. Chlorosis can come from a number of different things, though, as many of us know. If you have compacted soils or waterlogged soils, you might see some yellowing in the crown, and that's what chlorosis is, right? Chlorosis, lack of chlorophyll, the inability for the plant to be green. A number of different insects and mites can also cause chlorosis, but for folks living out here in the West or maybe in an urban soil, it's probably a girdling root again, or maybe a nutrient issue. So the best thing to do, once again, walk through that diagnostic checklist. Go and look at that location, look at the root flare, see if you find a girdling root. Let's just say you don't. The next thing to jump in and do would be to get a soil analysis report. What this is going to do is it's going to show you a few things. And all the reports show something a little bit different. This will tell you about some of the nutrients that are up in the tree or in the soil. And look at the pH. 7.4 with a buffer index of 8.3. Oh, Coors Brewery, of course, that's where the pH is. Now, what that pH is going to do is it's going to tie up nutrients. So it's not that you don't have some of those critical nutrients that are needed for chlorophyll production, but it's just the pH is so high that it gets tied up. So for instance, if you're looking at around a 7.5, 7 3/4, which I don't think is uncommon for a lot of your urban soils, you're going to see that iron, manganese, and boron are extremely low. And those are all extremely important for chlorophyll production. So what do we do about it? Something you can do, and this is what we had a customer, now an ArborJet customer, come to us and basically say, Korey, I've been doing trunk injections for years with an iron chelate. It's never worked. So we did a plant analysis of the actual tissue. If you look at this, Fe it's Latin for iron. If you look at this, you'll see the iron within that leaf surface is 20x, 20 times what it needs to be to have a healthy tree. But if you look at the manganese that they haven't been trunk injecting, it's less than a third of what it needs at minimum. So no wonder they were trunk injecting the tree for years and they weren't getting any good results because it was missing that key nutrient. Our solution to that, do a fall trunk injection with Minjet Fe. This is basically an iron, manganese, boron, zinc, copper, all the good stuff, everything that's required, directly into the root flare into the fall. Now, if you do this, you should get 2 to 3 seasons of green up, new growth. Side note, if you do any iron treatment, make sure you set the expectation to the homeowner that every single leaf will turn black or brown and fall off. For those of you who know what I'm talking about, it'll save you a headache. It'll save you a painful Friday night call. If you do have a tree that's also chlorotic or yellow and it's grown in a parking lot or barely grown in a parking lot, go ahead and hit it with that Minjet Fe and a shortstop combo. That's that plant growth regulator, because you get that thicker, waxier leaf, more fibrous roots, and then you also get all those nutrients that that plant needs. Something I like to point out about that picture is if you look in the background, that grass is actually pretty stressed, a lot more stressed in 2019 than it was the year before. So something to think about. Now, I don't need to get on anybody and talk about the news. You guys can all, and gals, can do that whenever you want. But if you were to pull up your favorite news outlet and you looked up the top stories of 2020, you'd probably find something like COVID. Maybe they'll talk about elections, hemp, maybe in Colorado, I don't know, water restrictions, and then next year the Batman coming out. But that water restrictions, I think that's going to be something that, regardless of where you live in the country, that's going to be something of greater concern moving forward. So although this data is 8-9 years past due, something worth note, and find out where you are on this map. Something worth note is that water costs are going up. Right? Everything is, but water costs are. So you look at all these states and all these cities, and this information, like we said, 8-10 years old. I mean, it's only gone up more since then. Denver, it's gone up 78%. I guarantee it's gone up more since then. Tampa, 117. I think Atlanta takes the bacon on this, 233%. So with water costs going up, we've got to get creative about what we're going to do to cut back on the water that we're using. In Australia in the late 90s, they came up with a product that was used as a dust suppressant. They basically put it down to keep the dust down. Neighbors, kangaroos, everybody was complaining apparently. They put this product down and it helped retain the moisture. Hydratain, right? So what this product basically does, and it is a product that you can use more in the turf world, at least that's how it started out. Basically what it does is it condenses any available humidity or atmospheric moisture or moisture that's in the soil, and it condenses it into moisture that can be used and taken up by plant roots, okay? When it was first tested on turf, the results were incredible. Clemson University, they got an okay football team, but they have a good research department, and they played with, it looks like, on some poinsettias. My thought, and a lot of you are probably wondering, Korey, what does this have to do with trees? Well, what if we could add it to our trees? What would that look like? So for folks who do a deep root fertilizer, or maybe late fall or winter watering, try throwing a little hydrotane in, and Zach and I can put the spelling of that in the chat box a little bit later. But I think that's going to be one of the trendier things, one of the new things in the years to come. You can either add it to your current fertilizer mix, or you can add it to our Arbor RX program. And then once again, if you had the option to play with shortstop, that plant growth regulator, it's going to make a thicker, waxier leaf. So that leaf is going to hold on to a lot more moisture, thus reducing the stress on the plant. Now, something to touch on briefly, because tree ADD is real, and you can't just leave it at home. On a recent trip I took to Cheyenne, Wyoming last winter, I was working with the Urban Forestry Department and walked outside from our meeting and realized that never seen this anywhere else in the world. Every single tree was leaning to the right. And because it's Wyoming, I couldn't help but wonder, is it a political statement? But we don't want to go there. So I asked, and I said, well, what's up with the trees all leaning over? What's going on? Maybe it has to do with this music festival that they have, or Cheyenne Frontier Days, a big rodeo. Maybe the trees are trying to get out of there. Maybe it has to do with the oil, and maybe there's something in the water in Wyoming. For those of you who have never been, there is definitely something in the water in Wyoming. But maybe it's phototropism, the plant's ability to grow towards the sun. Well, if you ever get a chance to look at a wind map, or if your Adderall really kicks in, and you start looking up different wind speeds across the country, what you'll find out is Cheyenne, Wyoming, even on its least windy months, has an average wind speed of 12 miles an hour. Average, sustained. We typically think of Chicago, right? The windy city. Look at their wind speed. Even at its windiest months in the wintertime, it doesn't hold a flame to Cheyenne. So that's what was actually causing the trees to grow over on their sides like that. The last thing that we'll touch on is this, folks, and this is in an effort to illustrate how we can make this industry better for everyone. This is a phone call that I got last summer. Well, actually, this isn't. It came on this. I was called out to a property for this. Working with one of the local landscapers up in Grand Lake, Colorado, about 20 minutes from my home, he called me up and he said, Korey, this yacht club has all of these lodgepole pine trees that have scale. They look sick. There's scale everywhere. We got to have a chemical treatment. What's the chemical treatment? What do we do? Well, I showed up, snapped this photo, and then had a nice come to Jesus moment and heart to heart with this individual and let him know that, in my humble opinion, that's not scale. That tree is also not a lodgepole pine. It's a bristlecone pine. For those of you who are unaware, bristlecone pines have resin ducts, which is what you saw in that previous photo. Resin ducts all over, okay? So it's not an insect. There's no chemical treatment that's gonna fix that trait. So we got to talking, and this individual, it was contagious. He was eating it up. We were talking and showed him what a bristlecone looks like compared to a lodgepole and what the needles are doing. We actually went as far as to Google it. Did you know that the oldest living organism on this earth is a bristlecone pine? It's around 5,000 years old and grows somewhere between or somewhere on that California-Nevada line. 5,000 years old. To give you just some relevance of what this tree has seen or been around during, Jesus Christ, 2,000 years ago, that tree probably didn't look much better, but that tree was 3,000 years old when Jesus Christ walked the earth, or when he walked on water. That tree was probably around what scientists predict the time of Stonehenge. which when you can have that conversation with somebody and there's that give and take, you're really just moving and progressing this industry so much farther. I mean, that gentleman left the meeting just so hyped to go look and learn and touch trees, and it was so fulfilling. And I think oftentimes as arborists, we're not talking about this. Too quickly, we just talk about the different diseases, the different insects, the chemicals that we need to use. Sometimes just educating yourself, doing the right thing is going to take you a lot further. Plus, it's a really good experience to bring your new dog and show people, right, because it's so close to home, on what they can do. So instead of removing that tree and that line of bristlecone pines, we just did that pruning. See that light pruning? That was also an opportunity for us to discuss the 3-cut method that many of us arborists know. And like I said, I got to bring Duke. He's the pup. We haven't told him yet he's adopted though, but we still love him. All right, folks. So in conclusion today, if you got anything out of this, the goal is hopefully that your mind's been expanded, right? Become an ISA arborist if you're not yet at a minimum. Help raise the bar. Once you get to ISA standings, maybe look to grow yourself even more. Join TCIA. What they're going to do is they're going to hold you to a higher caliber, a higher level of learning. And this fall and this winter, even though we're not all going to get together and sing Kumbaya together and watch these outstanding presentations by people who clearly have too much time on their hands, educate yourself. Turn on some webinars. I'm sure ArborJet will have a whole slew of them, and just tune in, okay? The most important thing about our tree industry, in any industry for that matter, is that there's no such thing as a silver bullet. There's no one solution for everything. There's no cure-all for everything. There's no silver bullet. Until it's 5 o'clock, and then in the tree industry it is. All right, I hope you learned something. Hope you had a lot of fun. Something we're gonna do is just open it up. Zach, if you wanna kick any questions our way. Folks in attendance, make sure you check us out on our additional fall webinars, but also look for our early order program where we'll get you some of the best prices and products of the season. As always, follow us on social, add us on Facebook, LinkedIn. I don't know who in the office tweets, but look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.